What's going on, everybody? Cannaclinical here, and today I want to talk about how cannabis can be used to stimulate appetite. There is actually something here in the literature beyond what we intuitively think about the munchies, and so I want to start this series about appetite stimulation with cannabis with a quick study about HIV-positive men being given cannabis, and let's see how it affects their appetite. This is a 2011 study out of San Diego, and they're working off of the idea that the endocannabinoid system actually helps regulate appetite, and that using a drug that manipulates these endocannabinoid levels could stimulate the pathways that modify hunger. Hunger and satiety is a pretty multifaceted concept because it has both neurological and endocrine triggers. This study is looking specifically at the endocrine triggers and the levels of specific hormones that signal hunger and satiety, such as ghrelin, which is produced in the stomach, leptin, which is produced primarily in fat cells, insulin produced in the pancreas, and peptide YY or PYY produced in the gastrointestinal mucosa. Ghrelin signals hunger while leptin and PYY signal for satiety. Insulin is released in response to elevated blood glucose and interestingly also functions secondarily as a satiety signal. So now that we have a little bit of background, let's get into the experimental design. This is a double-blind placebo-controlled study that gives either cannabis or placebo cannabis, which is basically just cannabis minus the cannabinoids, to subjects to smoke throughout the day in cigarette form. This was a sub-study from a parent study that was evaluating neuropathic pain in these HIV-infected males, and it consisted of 5 phases. A 1-week wash-in to evaluate baseline pain measurements, a 5-day active or placebo smoked cannabis period, 2 weeks of a detox to clear the drugs from the system, another 5 days of active or placebo cannabis, and finally a 2-week detox where final measurements were taken. There were some exclusion criteria also, like a substance abuse disorder in their history for cannabis, a history of psychosis or intolerance to cannabis, use of marinol, which is a synthetic form of THC, a positive drug screening for cannabinoids during the phase 1 wash-in, history of cannabis dependence, and complicating conditions such as congestive heart failure. So the procedure for this study was fairly simple. The 7 participants who agreed to participate in this sub-study were given cannabis and titrated up to a tolerant concentration for them, where they experienced a tolerable level of adverse side effects while maximizing their pain relief, and they utilized a variety of different standard potencies to do this, to titrate up to that level. There were 4 smoking sessions throughout an 8-hour day during the testing weeks. On all but the first day, so on day 2, 3, 4, and 5, blood sampling was done before smoking and after the last smoke session, so that there were 2 data points that were compared on each testing day. A few of them did not complete the placebo week, while all of them completed the THC week. Funny how that works. Also, during 3 testing days during each week, the morning sample was done 1 day before the afternoon sampling instead of the morning before, so it's clear that these studies are not without their holes, and this raises questions about the validity of these results, but they attempted to adjust for this statistically in their analysis of the data. The results of this study were promising. We're looking at a comparison between AM and PM, where the AM blood sample was prior to smoking. We see an increase in hunger-stimulating ghrelin, an increase in leptin, and a decrease in PYY and insulin compared to placebo. This chart displays the raw values, but just for comparisons as far as percentages go, ghrelin was increased by 42% compared to a 12% decline in the placebo group. Leptin was increased by about 67% compared to an 11% increase given placebo. PYY decreased around 14%, while it increased by 23% with placebo. And finally, insulin dropped a similar amount between both groups, around 30-34%. This chart displays dose response, in which compares plasma concentrations of THC and the concentrations of those hormones. What we see here is that ghrelin has a strong positive correlation while leptin has a strong negative correlation. And this suggests that higher doses of THC seem to promote a greater increase in the release of ghrelin, while it leads to a smaller increase in the release of leptin. Insulin and PYY do not seem to have much, if any, relationship at all across THC plasma concentrations. Now, the data for this isn't presented here in this paper because this is the sub study, but it is worth noting that in regards to the parent study, in the discussion they do also note that THC produced pain relief to the sensory neuropathy that was being evaluated in the parent study. Yay. Just an interesting factoid, but back to the main topic of this video. Let's talk flaws. There were a few confounding variables that were not taken into account. One of them was standard dosing. There was no standard dosing. They basically gave them THC of different concentrations based on the tolerability of the adverse side effects. So there was no standard dose that was given to all of the participants. So that's something that we need to keep in mind. Also, increased caloric intake would logically be a consequence of an increased desire to eat, but the fluctuation of these hormones from the actual feeding behavior itself could account for some of the variance here, since they didn't carefully control for this in the study. So the degree to which that could be attributable to the cannabis itself and not the alteration in the feeding behavior is unclear given the design of this study. But let's also acknowledge that an alteration in feeding behavior is the point of stimulating your appetite with cannabis in practice, and any positive effect would satisfy the spirit of this study. But leaving it up to the discretion of the subject entirely doesn't lend itself to controlled experimental settings if we're trying to isolate variables here as we are. However, the researchers do say that cannabis induced a change in ghrelin that is similar to that of normal volunteers. And given that there are only 2 testing points throughout the day, the resolution of these results would definitely be improved by adding more data points with which you can monitor the fluctuation of these hormones levels throughout the day in response to, feeding behavior and things like that. And also more careful monitoring of the feeding behavior and when they ate might also explain this fluctuation in hormone levels independent of the smoking of cannabis. That said, the results regarding ghrelin do agree with previous studies where subjects were given an endocannabinoid receptor antagonist, and I'm actually going to go through one of those in one of the next videos in this series. In the study they reference on page 49, the antagonist reduced the normal increase in ghrelin brought on by fasting, which suggests that endocannabinoids could play a role in mediating this fluctuation. PYY, under normal conditions, tends to correlate inversely with ghrelin, and this is actually shown in the results here as PYY decreased while ghrelin increased in the cannabis trial. And since it's a satiety hormone, this also suggests that decreasing levels would lead to an increased appetite. This, combined with the negative correlation with THC and leptin, meaning that the greatest increase in leptin corresponds with the smallest plasma concentrations of THC, it could indicate that these findings, at the very least, agree with each other to some degree, even though an overall increase in leptin certainly doesn't lead to hunger under normal conditions. So with the data presented, that leptin increase was not sufficiently explained. Naturally, more study on this particular phenomenon would go a long way to clarify why this happened. To conclude, even though this study had its flaws, this is a good place to start, and the results so far agree with previous studies on ghrelin secretion in response to cannabinoid receptor activation. It's important to learn how cannabis actually affects appetite beyond the subjective and stoner science, because there are several debilitating conditions such as HIV and cancer that would be relevant areas to study how you could potentially implement this into an adjunct treatment plan. Anyways, that's about all I have for you guys. Tell me what you think down below. If you haven't already, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel for more, and hit that notification bell. Until next time, stay medicated, guys.